Welcome to Tracy's Terrors. If you love horror and appreciate smart animal commentary, then you are in the right place. Today, Strigoi, VamPullet, and I will be discussing Daisy Pearce's 2025 novel, Something in the Walls. Now, before we get started, a couple of things. First, there will be spoilers in this review, but honestly, knowing in advance what happens here may actually make you less disappointed with the book than I was. Secondly, lately I feel like I am in a horror fiction desert. Nothing is speaking to me, and that makes me sad. So if you are reading anything really great lately, please leave it in the comments. Please share it with me. I would appreciate it. Thirdly, subscribe to the channel. Okay, let's get into it. Paul Tremblay's A Head Full of Ghosts is hands down the best treatment of possession in the age of hypermediation, bringing into play the power of religious belief, the economic exploitation of children, the culture of spectacle, and just maybe the actual supernatural. Tremblay dramatizes the impossibility of finding a definitive truth amid, endlessly proliferating interpretations. Since he's clearly got the social media age pinned down, I mean, what else is there to add or improve upon in this modern classic? I was really excited to see that Daisy Pearce was taking possession back to the 1980s, before the proliferation of personal technologies, when questions of voice, authenticity, and truth were still slippery, but in different ways. Like Tremblay, Pearce examines the role of poverty, faith, parenting, and media. Here, it's the newspaper and not reality TV, in both eliciting and shaping possession narratives. The problem is that while A Head Full of Ghosts revels in indeterminacy, Pearce is so uncomfortable with it that she pulls a Godwin's Law move, introducing a child molester into a story that doesn't need one, and in this way collapsing narrative nuance into clear, moralizing answers. This move to cut corners is also evident in the construction of Mina, a protagonist whose backstory is a perfect example of what Pearce Segal calls the trauma plot. This threadbare trope reduces a protagonist's entire personality into a traumatic experience, a past traumatic experience, the nature of which is revealed in constant flashbacks, and dictates a by now painfully predictable arc of confrontation, acceptance, and healing. What makes this particular instantiation of the trauma plot especially bad is that Mina's backstory is a tale of pure Victorian melodrama, obviously out of place in a contemporary narrative. And this brings me to my biggest issue with the novel. Its underestimation of the reader. It's as if we, unable to calculate what was probable at different historical periods, might be convinced that the 1880s are actually the 1980s. Similarly, we have to forget everything we know when considering the novel's premise, a setup in the realist mode that can't withstand even the lightest scrutiny. To be clear, I realize that not every book can be A Head Full of Ghosts, and I'm perfectly willing to leave my brain at the door for a good time. Everyone loves a popcorn horror novel, but with its relentlessly dreary tone, Something in the Walls isn't just unsophisticated, it is just downright joyless. So let's jump into the summary, and obviously if you've read the book, skip ahead. Something in the Walls is set in the summer of 1989 in Cornwall, England, where an extreme heat wave is causing widespread misery. Our main character, Mina Ellis, has recently graduated with a bachelor's degree in psychology and is planning her wedding to Oscar, an older, straight-laced physicist. Despite her recent academic achievement and her upcoming marriage, Mina is unhappy. Her relationship with Oscar is troubled, and without experience, she can't get ahead in her chosen field, or so she says. More on that later. To make matters worse, Mina is overwhelmed by guilt and grief. When she was a teen, her beloved younger brother, Eddie, died of pneumonia, and she's never recovered from the loss. So at a bereavement support group, she meets Sam, a journalist who is struggling with the death of his young daughter, Maggie. Combining his personal quest to contact Maggie's spirit with his work as a reporter, Sam has been investigating Alice Weber, a troubled teen who claims to be possessed by a witch. He invites Mina to assist him on the case in her capacity as a child psychologist, and Mina jumps at the chance to hone her professional skills. So they go to the town, the depressed town of Bannathel. And when 3 people connected with Alice die unexpectedly, the townspeople's reverence for her as a kind of medium, able to speak to the dead, quickly turns into condemnation, and they accuse her of witchcraft and turn to traditional rituals for casting out the devil. Can Mina de-escalate this situation before it spirals out of control, or is her personal history clouding her better judgment? The novel's premise is a real stumbling block for me, and since it's the foundation on which everything else rests, I had a hard time engaging with the world that Pearce creates. Contrary to what Mina says, no one expects a psych BA to round up cowboy style their own patients for independent counseling, and in fact, to do so without guidance would be considered inappropriate and unethical. I know that 1989 was a long time ago, and I'm showing my age, but the academic landscape wasn't the Wild West. Then, as now, it would have been unheard of for someone in Mina's position to meet a deeply troubled teen and offer diagnoses outside of a clinical setting and without supervision of any kind. So either Pearce assumes we're ignorant, or she just can't be bothered to do some really basic research, and that stance, either to the reader or to the act of writing, you take your pick, shapes the entire work so that it feels like a long exercise in condescension. Whether or not we're being treated as idiots, Mina's insistence that in order to get ahead, she must solicit her own child clients is so over the top that I couldn't suspend my disbelief. Nor should I have to in a book that, up to this point in the story is not grappling with ghosts and demons, but just trying to approximate the actuality of 80s Britain. If the beginning of the novel is a challenge for me, so too is the end. Faced with social and economic decline, Bannathel, we're told repeatedly, needs Alice as a scapegoat, a convenient person to take the blame for problems that are too complex to untangle and too amorphous to face directly. But it seems to me that, like the town, the plot of the book also needs a scapegoat. And that figure is Bert, the pedophile, a character engaged in acts so indisputably evil, who doesn't hate a child molester, is to shut down all other narrative possibilities. When Mina first arrives in Bannathel, she outlines the layered conditions that could underline Alice's so-called possession, and even explain the town's continued fascination with the riddance ritual, a traditional ceremony meant to counter witchcraft. She even leaves, wiggle room for supernatural and even meteorological causes. It wouldn't be the first time that intense heat made people crazy. The thing is, Mina raises lots of interesting questions, but she never tries to answer them. And even the witch, who supposedly speaks through Alice, is never given a name. So was she an actual historical figure or just a figment of the girl's imagination? If she was real, this witch, what happened to her, and what could she possibly want now? Obviously a visit to a local archive, like Buffy style, would have been in order, but Mina and Sam are too busy doing very little. Ultimately, Pearce tosses these topics to the side, I suspect because she's not sure what to do with them. One option would have been to suspend them in a delicate tension, ending the novel on a tantalizingly indeterminate note a la Paul Tremblay in A Head Full of Ghosts. But that's not the approach she takes. Instead, she shelves murky subjects that resist clear resolution and focuses on something black and white. Child molesters are bad. It turns out that Bert, the much beloved neighbor who for decades has been taking in troubled girls, isn't the hero everyone thought he was. Discovering an envelope of Polaroids, Mina learns that he was actually drugging, undressing, and photographing minors, sexually traumatizing his victims before funneling them into riddance ceremonies, the public expiatory rituals over which he presides. Through this injection of pedophilia and sadism, Pearce approaches storytelling, vis-a-vis Godwin's law. An undeniably revolting figure like Bert immediately eclipses all other considerations and narrative possibilities, which means that we no longer have to think about the myriad factors at play in Bannathel because, child molestation. It feels like a cheap shot, a clear-cut climax to a complicated story that Pearce perhaps feared might collapse under the weight of a more ambiguous ending. I wish she had taken the risk, though. Not only does the introduction of a pedophile simplify the story's through line, but it forces us to side with Mina, a character who otherwise might not garner much sympathy. The novel's final conflict pits her in a WWF-style face-off against the arch-villain Bert, so that in this clear contest of good versus evil, we have no choice but to root for her. Still, I can't help but roll my eyes at such heavy-handed manipulation, and my resistance once again comes from the lack of plausibility. Not so much the plausibility of the situation, though it is painfully contrived, but of her character in general. Mina's entire identity, like that of so many other characters in contemporary fiction, is based on a traumatic event, which, while reductive in and of itself, is made even worse by the fact that the incident in question could have been pulled from the yellowing pages of a 19th century melodrama. The embodiment of joy and innocence, Eddie, her younger brother, catches a fatal case of pneumonia by going outside in cold weather and lying briefly on the surface of a frozen lake. This scenario is already, positively Victorian, but Pearce ratchets up the treacly sentimentality by repeatedly telling us that Eddie only went onto the ice, brace yourself, to save Mina, who had fallen through. It's important to remember here that 1983, the year Eddie would have died, was not the Stone Age. Back then, we knew that viruses were not transmitted by cold temperatures, and even had things like hospitals and antibiotics. Pneumonia was treatable, and while it's certainly possible that a teenager with a weakened immune system could succumb to the illness, I know this can happen, please don't come at me, such an outcome would have been very unusual. The obvious purpose of this Dickensian tale is to evoke compassion for the grieving Mina. For me, however, it seriously backfires. While Dickens' Little Nell had readers bawling in 1841, that kind of character is comical now, and if there are any tears in my eyes, it's from laughter, not sadness. The narrative of Eddie's death isn't as straightforward as Mina initially leads us to believe, and it's her confrontation with these elided details that, in full keeping with the trauma plot, is the key to her character's arc such as it is. Toward the end of the novel, we discover that Mina hastened Eddie's death by smothering him with a pillow. When we finally have access to this memory, it is framed not as a murder, but as a mercy killing. She just couldn't bear to watch his suffering, and besides, his death was imminent. Her responsibility for the act is lessened even further by his own complicity. Just before she places the cushion over his face, Eddie asks her to repeat the story of how, cue the violins, he saved her from the ice, so that he can ascend to heaven on memories of his own heroism. It's clearly supposed to be a bittersweet moment, and we are supposed to regard Mina's deed as noble, something that any compassionate person might do for a loved one who was suffering. But is it? The logic of her trauma arc is that once she's confronted with this difficult event, letting herself recall it in its entirety, she can accept what she's done, which shouldn't be hard since it is presented as a loving gesture, and release the guilt that's been holding her back. It's all very feel-good pop psychology. Still, if earlier we were listening to a maudlin violin score, this apotheosis of therapeutic self-love is, at least for me, when the strings snap. Honorable intentions or not, I don't think Mina should let herself off the hook so easily for killing a 14-year-old boy with a treatable illness. And I think that this is why Mina has to go to war with a pedophile. Without the clear moral authority that such a fight gives her, readers like me might enjoy watching the townspeople take her out Summer Isle style. Hell, even with the Bert battle, I would have much preferred a Wicker Man-esque ending in which Mina goes up in flames. I don't want to be accused of subjecting a female protagonist to the likability test, a battery of assessments gauging relatability, friendliness, and morality, to which male characters are rarely subjected. My problem with Mina isn't that she's unlikable, rather it's that she feels like the creation of someone who is pandering to their decidedly female audience, making assumptions about women readers that kind of trouble me. after finishing this book, I sat imagining the kinds of toxic conversations that must happen, among authors and publishing professionals when they try to imagine what women want. So, as I've said, I'm having a hard time finding horror fiction lately that is working for me. So if you have read something that is smart and scary, please drop it in the comments and help me out, right? Thank you so much for joining us today. If you enjoyed the episode, even if you didn't, please subscribe to the channel. Visit us at our website, tracysterrors.com, and we will see you next time. Take care.